Excuse me. On behalf of the Forest Speak Committee, excuse me, I don't know what I swallowed. I want to welcome you and to say how pleased I am that all of you are not deterred by the fact that you no longer have afternoon Forest Speak programs. You now have 7 o'clock in the evening Forest Speak programs, and that doesn't seem to in any way interfere with people's enthusiasm for the speakers that we have for us. The first thing I want to say is just to ask that people turn their phones off. It seems that every time we have somebody has a phone to ring, so if you'll be sure your phones are turned off. And then the other announcement I have is just to say that Lois will take questions at the end of her talk, and I ask that you please raise your hand and wait until you have the microphone before you ask your question, so that each of us knows what you have said, okay? I think that's the only part of the program that's just pure announcements. And I'm going to turn the microphone over now to Mary DeBard, who's going to introduce our speaker.
And I'm so proud to introduce Dr. Lois Oliver. She spent her first 33 years of life in Pittsburgh, where she also got 2 nursing degrees and a medical degree at the University of Pittsburgh. She had her medical training in Philadelphia and Boston, and when Dr. Sam Katz was recruited by Duke to come and head the pediatrics department, he brought Lois with him. And so she was in charge of the pediatric clinic and the emergency room, and was also an associate dean of admissions at that time. And then the new chair of the pediatrics department at her alma mater in Pittsburgh was Dr. Thomas Oliver. And he recruited her back to her alma mater there. And they married, and and when he was appointed to the American Board of Pediatrics in 1987, their headquarters are in Chapel Hill, so they came tootling back to North Carolina, and Lois goes back to Duke. And this time, she's a half-time dean of admissions and half-time admitting dean, advisory dean for students. She retired in 1997, though she did some teaching for several years after that. And she became widowed in 2002. She has 2 stepchildren and 5 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild born this year. She came to the Forest in 2014. And her non-medical credentials, she does lots of things. She was on the board at the Duke Gardens for many years. I think she was the head of the board there. She was the head docent at Duke Chapel, has done OLLI courses on Duke Chapel. She served as our resident association president here, and many volunteer things at the Forest at Duke, and she's a very popular dinner companion in Heartwood for everybody, and she has a wealth of stories. She's only talking about 1 chapter in her very full life, which we will hear about tonight. So I'll turn this over to Lois.
Okay, I want to be sure, can you all hear me? Okay, are you ready? First of all, I want to do a little backup. My sister was a serious Presbyterian, and she went off to Assyria to a mission school in Aleppo to teach English right after college. And while she was there, the U.S. opened a consulate office in Aleppo, and she met and eventually married the junior consular officer. And so when they came, they moved about a bit, but anyway, they were back there. She had a baby, and I went over and spent 5 months, because when I quit working, you know, I was still a nurse. I quit working, and there was no pull to get me to go back, so I stayed with her and the new baby for 5 months. So I just preface this to tell you that I do know something about living in the Middle East. But what I'm going to tell you about now is that I was minding my own business in 1994 at Duke, and the chancellor and dean called me, and the chancellor mostly called me in and said, how would you like to go to Saudi Arabia? And I said, not a chance. And he said, well, wait a second. He said, finally he said, well, you have to go. We need your passport. You're leaving on, this was Wednesday, you're leaving on Friday for 4 days in Riyadh. And I'm like, what? Well, as you all know, the Saudis have quite a lot of money. And so it turned out that over the years, about 10 years prior to this, the Duke Department of Surgery and several other departments had maintained rotating faculty that went out there and lived, and there was a little colony outside of Riyadh where these Duke docs lived while they did their volunteer things. And I didn't know any of this, right? So anyway, they told me that I had to be at the airport and on the plane on Friday. So, you know, I went. And I get on Saudi Air. Got to be the most comfortable flying I've ever done, a big puffy seat, very, very suave. And when we finally got to Riyadh, we were put up in the Marriott Hotel, and just spent, we got there, I don't remember what time we got there, but in the morning, we were taken over to the King Fahd Medical School, where we met with Dr. Tahir. And it turned out that the deal was with 5 U.S. medical schools that were sending experts over to teach. Yale, Duke, UVA, Baylor, and what was the other one? It'll come to me. Anyway, the 5 of us. So this group was now 5 admissions officers, all admission deans. And of course, as you might suspect, I was the only woman. So we're sitting in a row in front of Dr. Tahir, and George Washington was the 5th school, and they were, in fact, admitting students from Saudi Arabia. And what the meeting was for these other 4 schools to start admitting Saudi students, because they were giving us lots of money if we admitted them. So it seemed like that to them it was a good idea. But for those of you who know how medical schools work, you would know why it was not possible. George Washington has a 6-year program, so you can start out of high school, do 2 years, and then go to medical school all in one stream. But the rest of us, you have to have either almost an undergraduate degree or an undergraduate degree before you can go to medical school. So now we're all lined up sitting in this arc in front of Dr. Tahir, who is a very handsome Lebanese who'd emigrated to Saudi Arabia because he made more money. He told us that. Anyway, so he starts with, the Yale guy was sitting next to me, and he said, and so when will you be interviewing students? And he said, not going to happen. And then Dr. Tahir, in typical Arab fashion, skipped over me and went to the next, and the other two said, you know, the Baylor and UVA said they weren't. And then he said, well, we want you all to watch how George Washington handles the interview process and the selection process. And then Big Mouth raised their hand. And I said, we can't do that. And he said, why not? And I said, in the United States, the process of admitting people to medical school is each school's program. It's not something you share or anybody else knows about. And so, no, we're not gonna, we're not gonna do it. So I've already established myself as not exactly cooperative. And the other thing was, even though I know because of my years in the Middle East, I never, ever covered my head or wore a robe. I stayed. And, but anyway, so now we had gone through this group and nobody was going to be interviewing, but the men were free to go in downtown and shop. And Riyadh has beautiful stores. It has all kinds of good stuff, right? But I'm trapped in the hotel. I can't go anywhere. I can't go anywhere because I'm a woman, right? And I don't have a brother, a father, a husband, anybody to accompany me. So I figure I'm going to be stuck in this hotel for 4 days. And then, but back in the day, I had actually learned 2 or 3 Arabic words. I knew how to say hello, marhaba, and shukran, thank you, which I said to the driver of the van that took us to various things. And so he realized that I was going to be trapped. So after the men could go wherever they wanted, but he came each day to the hotel, and he took me out to see the sights. For the first day, we just drove around the city, saw the embassies, and you know, it is a beautiful city. And we had this lovely time, and I got all that because I said thank you and hello to him. And so I thought that was working pretty well. And then the next day, he didn't speak English, but he indicated that he would pick me up in the morning, and we would do something more interesting. I mean, that was sort of his implication. So I was ready in the morning, and I was always covered mostly, but no heads covering and so forth, no robe. And so he said he was going to take me to a sultan's palace. Now, those of you who know Saudi Arabia know that there's not a single tree in the country, right? It's sand. So wooden buildings would be unusual. But this sultan's palace, they had obviously imported wood, and they had built this palace, which the men were the driver of the van was quite proud of. So he ushered me, he took me to the palace, and we got out, and there were 3 rooms on the first floor and 3 rooms on top, and each one of them was lined wall, floor, with beautiful oriental rugs. And so they were proud, you know, to show all that off. And then and then they walked me around that whole area at the time, and they said that the next day we would go and see where the people, not the Sultan, where the people lived. So the next morning, I know I'm really I'm really bonding with the tour guide and the bus driver because the men weren't using them, and so the guys were bored, right? So he said he took me out, and as I said, I'm covered, right? And it's 103 degrees. And he said, we're going to go out and see something special. I mean, that was his implication. So we start walking, and we walk for half a mile, and I'm sweating. And we come to a mostly clay and straw wall. And we go up on the wall, and there's the driver and the guide, right, and me. And what do boys do when they come to a wall like that? They did their little dance, and then they, with great pride, pointed over to the side of this wall where there was a stone tower. It was maybe 12 feet tall. And they said that it was a water tower, and on it, in English, it said water. I said, not water, watch. And so we did that. I was doing charades a lot. And so then they wanted me to change the word. And all I had was a ballpoint pen. So I scratched out the ER and put in CH, but I don't know if anyone would. Anyway, they were very proud that they had brought that, sort of up to snuff. And it was just they were so kind, those men, and really, so I had, I think, a better experience than the men did, who were just wandering around the city on their own. They weren't getting the sort of attention. But then at the very end, maybe let's just say the other admissions deans, we all went out for dinner together with some of the Saudis at a fancy restaurant where, guess what? I was the only woman, and that one of my entertainments was that at our dinner place setting, there were three wine glasses, and one had something pink in it, and one had something sort of golden in it, and one had something clear. And I mean, I know they were supposed to look like wine glasses and be wine, but when I tasted them, they were all fruit juice and water was what they were. So there was a lot of sort of disappointment, but I don't want to imply that I'm an alcoholic, but I had taken some bourbon. And before we went out for dinner, I had a little bourbon and water, and we went out for dinner. And I left the bourbon bottle sitting on my dresser. And I don't think they had a clue what it was, because nobody touched it the whole time I was there. Anyway, it was, so that was the dinner together. And then we had another meeting, and the next day, they wanted us, as I said, to watch George Washington interview the candidates, and we had said we weren't going to do that, but we did kind of hang out, and we could see the students, the young people going in there to interview, and so that day was really boring. And then the finale, we're all gathered in an auditorium like this, and we're lined up in the front row, all the American deans, and they're going to introduce the students that the George Washington accepted, and there were 10 of them. And so they were introduced, and one by one, and those of us who weren't admitting anybody, everybody that was the George Washington group had all kinds of medallions that they'd been given, and we had like nothing. So they get finished with all this thing, and then afterwards there was a sort of, well, it wasn't a cocktail hour, but there was goodie hour after this presentation, so we could meet the students and talk to anybody. And so, since I knew the dean at George Washington, I was really quite entertained. So I said, I need to ask you a question. And he said, what's that? And I said, does George Washington have co-ed dorms? Yes, he said. I said, well, I think these guys might really enjoy seeing girls run down to the shower room or whatever. And so, and his eyes got really big, and he said, we'll have to think about that. I said, yes, you will, because they would think they were available, free, it's like, anyway, so but I do have to say that what I enjoyed was, of course, we didn't accept any of them, the rest of us, but George Washington, their accepted students came to DC and were put into the dorms, and that lasted about a week. And then, because they were so well-to-do, then they all bought or rented apartments of their own, and 5 of them got homesick and went home. And in the end, I think 6 of them stayed and did go, through the whole 6-year thing at George Washington. But all in all, it was like this total disaster. And I mean, as far as our Duke's relationship, because I've met people who served as volunteers from the surgery department, and others that did go over and work there for brief periods, and whether their wives stayed with them or not. But there's something to be said about when you have a lot of money, you can do things, you can attract things that are not wonderful, and that's really what this was. And I don't know when the contract ended, but I know it did end, and they stopped some years later. But I told the dean afterwards, I said, I never, ever send a woman to Saudi Arabia again. So there you have my trip. And if you have any questions, yes.
Enjoyable story, Lois. Why wouldn't Duke participate in accepting Saudi med students?
Because they would be coming out of high school, and we required that they have either almost a bachelor's degree or a bachelor's degree. So they weren't eligible. And that was true of all the other schools except George Washington. The Yale guy and I were both, we bonded over the whole thing.
Lois, it happened a long time ago, so I don't know if I'm asking a question that you don't perhaps recall, but were there any female visible employees at the Marriott while you stayed there?
At the Marriott,
Yes.
I'm trying to think. In the medical school, there was a woman in the main, sort of at the desk in the main office. I mean, she was completely covered, and there were a couple of women that worked in that area that weren't. They had long skirts and so forth, and I'm sure they had coverings, but they didn't wear them at work, and so. I don't remember seeing any.
I was just curious. Thank you.
Lois, if I may, it seems astonishing to me that major universities would send their admissions officers to Saudi Arabia without having all of these issues already settled as to what kind of criteria had to be met and so on. I mean, it sounds as though the Saudis were expecting you to say, "Oh yeah, send them," and
Well,
astonishing.
the thing that, we're talking money here. They already were dealing with faculty doing volunteer time there. So that, and the Saudis were paying, so the faculty had a grand time, and they got extra pay during the time they did their thing over there. But there was no such thing for students, and none of us would take a student that didn't have a degree, or wasn't close to a bachelor's degree. And so it was only George Washington that was possible. Your wife.
Given the nature of the culture, and as you said, you were the only woman there and other women were all covered, how did the people react when you were taken to these various sites, going through the Sultan's palace and whatever?
That's what truly amazed me. No, there was no reaction. I mean, nobody yelled at me, nobody. The guys, I think they thought it was amusing. They followed. But they stuck with me, and that's, I think, was my protection.
Yeah.
Was the driver and the tour guide stayed with me. So there, in a way, I had a male companion. Mm-hmm. But it was it was interesting. Just when I think back on it, when I came back, the Duke people will know that Ralph Snyderman. I told him that of all the bad ideas he ever had, that was one. But all Duke saw was the money. They were making big bucks out of that Saudi program. And I don't know when it finished altogether, but I know the admissions thing never took off.
Lois, I was at Duke in the 90s also, and I seem to recall that there were Saudis who came to Duke Hospital for medical treatment and stayed at the Washington Duke Inn, and the room
And took a whole floor.
Right, that's what I was going to say. Had
Yeah.
taken over is that true? And was it more
Yeah,
than one
the
incident?
the person, there was an otolaryngologist in the U.S. who was the one that started all this, and I don't know whether he trained at Duke, but he wasn't on the faculty at Duke, but he's the one that got the Saudis to buy Duke, to make contributions and do so. I don't know what happened to that relationship, but when I was just dumbfounded when they told me that it was all set. I showed up and they said, you have a plane ticket to Riyadh on Friday, it's Wednesday. Well, it's not exactly like you expect your school to do. What? There wasn't any exchange. It- Yeah. It was, but I will say that, you know, when I visited my family, my brother-in-law, the Foreign Service officer, you know, I really did not feel as uncomfortable as I think other people would have felt in the Middle East because of all the rules of Islam and, you know, the treatment of women, et cetera. It's something that I already knew about. Yeah.
Actually, what was wrong with Duke to send a woman? I mean, if you were being sent to Syria or Lebanon or Jordan, or even Egypt, I would have understood it. But to send a woman to Saudi Arabia to be not just a wife of someone, but actually an official, that shows very strange.
That shows that they don't have a
They don't
clue.
have a clue. That's what it
You're absolutely right. And when I came back, I didn't hesitate to let them know that that was the stupidest thing that they had done in quite a long time.
Can you hear me? Yeah. The students that were accepted, were they proficient in English? And when they came here, were they able to handle the program in the States? Or were they,
Yeah, the
ones that-
well, the students were accepted by George Washington.
Yeah,
Yes, they came and lived in the States, and I mean, lived in Washington and went to
right,
college.
and were they proficient in English when they came here? Or did use because of the language? Or
Were they what?
were they proficient in the language when they came to
Yeah,
Washington?
yes. That was one of the requirements, was that they had to be proficient enough to study in the States with, with English, let alone Latin and Greek. Yeah. Anyway, it was a, yes. What? I couldn't hear.
The students, none of them were women, right?
That's right, that's right.
Makes sense.
It was the whole thing was, just, I don't know when Duke gave it up, but one of the surgeons that I knew, he loved it. He did it for 10 years. He went over and back and so forth, but his wife wouldn't go. I think maybe he was escaping from her, as opposed. That's it.
I'm going to speak for Steve because it was his experience.
We can't hear you.
I've never used one. Hello? Okay. So Steve had a number of very close colleagues in Scandinavia, in Denmark and Sweden, who were urologists like him, and it was very, very common for them to go to Saudi Arabia, Syria, these countries to work, but these are physicians, these are not
Yes,
students.
yes.
But it was what you said, I thought this would be interesting. The older people, the older colleagues had no problem going. Their wives would come along, they'd be covered up because they made a ton of money, and their home life was so heavily taxed that this was the way they could have a vacation home or something that
Yeah.
they were not going to be allowed to have. The younger ones did not do it because their wives adamantly said there's no way.
Yeah,
And it was just this incredible divide.
yeah, that's
So-
amazing. I mean, the thing that's so impressive is the Saudis thought they could buy anything they needed, you know, including admission to your medical school. Well, it was very nice of you all to show up.
Hold on.
Wait a second, there's another question.
Okay. The curious question here is, do you know whether things have changed in all these years, and are there now women getting into the medical profession in Riyadh?
I have not kept up with my Saudi relationships, so I haven't any idea. But I seriously doubt it. Here's another question over here.
This isn't a question, this is just an experience. My husband went over and was working in Saudi for a few weeks, but during that time he played golf in Saudi Arabia. And I've got photographs of him on their golf course, which was just sand. And in order to hit off, you had a little mat that you put down on the sand, and you could tee off the mat. When you move it to the next spot, put your mat down and go on.
Well, the thing that is the most striking is that Saudi Arabia is all sand, except for Riyadh, and you know the city. It's just no matter where you look, I felt like I was at a very hot beach as soon as you step out of anywhere. It was I do not want to visit again.
Also went to a race, horse race with Gordon and all the Saudis, and I just wore ordinary clothes. And we were sitting with one of the princes, but they never said anything to me.
You see, the tragedy of all that is that a woman, if she needs to have gynecological health issues, she would have to go to a female doctor. They will not let her go to a male doctor. Most husbands will not allow it. So it is a problem if you do not, in some way in the United States and other countries, cooperate with them despite all their peculiarities, in order to help them get some doctors there who would be helpful to half of the population.
Well, I will tell you one thing that we were astonished at, all of us visitors. We were taken on a tour of a brand new hospital. It had everything: ICU, X-ray, CT scan, MRI, etc. Totally empty. It was built for women. It was a total thing, and it was built for women, but then they didn't have doctors to put patients in there. And so, but they had this wonderful facility